Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Again, I'd like to reiterate Stephen's thoughts, and thank you so much for the hospitality over the last couple of days. It's been phenomenal. Finland's quite cold, but at least the people are very... Sorry, I was just saying, Finland's very cold, but the people are very, very warm, that's for sure. I'm here to talk about a little bit more fine granular evaluation of the ref that was done independently by myself and my team that ended up being developed into a book, which is called Evaluator's Eye, and my publisher would kill me if I didn't put the image up and give myself a little bit of a plug as well. You've gone through what I call the mechanics of the ref exercise, the history, etc., and in specifically talking about the ref definition, which is, as Stephen said, quite intentionally broad. And that's really important when you think about my work, because I take a little bit of a different view about the assessment exercise, and I went in and I talked to the evaluators on main panel A, not using the words, but it's loosely around medical, clinical, biomedical, and all things medical sciences, and to actually have a look at how the impact criterion was being evaluated, and just identify that there's always this debate about whether peer review can be replaced by metrics, with the idea that, you know, if metrics comes with the same outcomes that peer review did, then obviously one can be replaced with the other. That, in my perceive, is a little bit naive, and I talk about this in my book, only because I see peer review as a very important process, and I see it as having benefits. Does anyone know what the benefits of peer review are? Anyone? Shout them out. No. Okay, that's funny, isn't it? Because we accept peer review as a part of our academic practice, and it's something that, you know, determines in a way how successful we are, will be, and if we ever can be. But we don't really actually ask ourselves what the benefits are. And I find that interesting in the debate about peer review versus metrics, because the benefits of peer review have become so tacit that we don't even use them to defend its use. And in fact, you know, I've had a lot of correspondence with people who favour a metrics-driven evaluation process for not only the evaluation of the outputs criterion, but also increasingly for the impact criterion. And I'm really really happy that one of the lessons was that it can't happen. Because they seem to think that peer review is something pure. Peer review is something that, you know, it's a tool in academic governance. It's done by experts, and so there is political safety in the idea that whatever the outcomes of peer review are accepted. They're not necessarily questioned, because we know they come from people who are expert and qualified and have experience, and so therefore are well positioned to be able to comment and give reliable criticism or feedback, but also make a decision about whether our grant, our promotion application, or our ref submission is considered excellent or not. And the funny thing is that when we talk about peer review generally for traditional forms of scientific excellence, it's quite obvious. We find it, you know, as I said, the benefits are quite tacit, because the idea of what is excellent in research is socialised into us as researchers from a very young age, from PhD age, etc. We know what excellence in research looks like, and we strive to do it. And therefore, because we all share the same ideals about what is excellent in research, we have no problem with experts getting together and reiterating the same definition of what is excellent in the peer-reviewed process to be able to make a decision. But with impact, that's a little bit different, because impact, as I say, is an ambiguous concept. What is good impact? How can you measure up the difference between what is excellent impact that saves 25 lives in Finland versus those that saves 1,000 lives in Africa? These kinds of decisions and these kinds of judgments need a human element, and that's where peer review is really quite important. And also I have to answer that peer review has a political role as well. It's been known as a black box, and there's safety in that black box. It devolves the responsibilities from the decision away from the funders themselves to a group of many different experts. And unfortunately, I come from Australia where, peer review is, and nothing ever happens in Australia, and nothing ever goes wrong in Australia, right? Except that, peer review is not necessarily always accepted as the truth. This only happened last week, actually, where the Australian Minister for Science decided that irrespective of a peer review decision about the excellence toward, funding for pieces of humanities research, that he would decide that that wasn't in the interest, so he would overrule the peer review decision and decide not to fund them. And just to let you know, Simon Birmingham is the minister, a new minister. We've had a couple of changes of prime minister and ministers over the last couple of years. This is the minister, and Senator Kim Carr is like the long-standing opposition or shadow minister for education. And he's basically said, I'm pretty sure that most Australian taxpayers prefer their funding to be used for research other than spending 223,000 Australian dollars on projects like post-Orientalist arts in the Strait of Gibraltar. Do you disagree, Senator Kim Carr? Or would Labor simply say yes to anything? And the argument is it's not a matter of whether a party or a government is saying yes or no. It's the fact that peer review is a very important role in academic self-governance and self-censorship, and that for political interests to outweigh that can be quite dangerous. So to talk about how I see peer review and how I look to the ref process as a practice, or actually as a process rather than, and to talk about metrics versus peer review, I'm going to tell you a little anecdote of my previous life. Who knows what this is? Come on, shout it out. Right, someone said a cell, someone said a neuron. You get 1/4 point for the cell, 1/2 point for a neuron. It's the human embryonic kidney cell, okay? And they're blank cells, and it's transfected with a CD4 and a glycine mutation DNA. This is what I used to do. And it's been interesting because this particular receptor is related to epilepsy, okay? And so you can see this is a nanometer. So if you take a hair and divide it into 900, that's about how big this is. So you can see 2 electrodes. One is delivering drugs, pushing them at the cell, and the other one is measuring the current that goes in and out of the cell. Okay, this is very quickly. And so what happens is that when the cell opens, which is what we want in epilepsy, because in epilepsy these particular cells quieten everything down in the brain. We want them to open because they quieten everything down in the brain when it gets overexcited. They open and they shut in response to glycine, which is, how it should be. And so what we were trying to do in these experiments is we were trying to find different drugs or combination of drugs that open them and let them stay open for longer. So you can see the slightly fatter graph on the end. That sort of shows you that it opens very quickly and it takes longer time for it to close. And that's what you want, because you want as much glycine going through this receptor as possible to calm down the overexcitement of an epilepsy attack. Okay. So I was in the lab one late night, just me and my cells, trying to get my n = 5. It's a very lonely existence that it was. Just me, my cells, and 100% ethanol that I had made into a 1:100 solution, and I was throwing it at these cells. And all of a sudden, in response to ethanol, it opened and then closed. And I went, oh my God. This has never happened before. Never happened before. No one had ever thrown alcohol at this cell to find out whether it made it open and stayed open. It stayed very open very late. So I redid the experiment again and again and again. I think I redid it about 15 times that before midnight. Again, open, close, open, close. It was amazing. I was thinking, wow, I'm going to be rich. I found the discovery for a cure for epilepsy, and I did some calculations, and basically my results meant that in order to maintain a healthy lifestyle and make sure that they didn't have too many attacks, that these poor people had to maintain a blood alcohol level of 0.06. But hey, whatever. Didn't matter, it worked. Open, close, open, close. I had n = 30 of these little cells in different plates, same breeder plate. Open, close, open, close. And I went home at about 2 o'clock in the morning with, illusions of grandeur and how, my career in neuroscience, as you can see, it didn't work out, was going to progress. And came in the next day to tell my supervisor, guess what happened? We're going to be rich. Which is our illusions as scientists, isn't it? That we're going to be rich from our discoveries, have impact, but it never really happened. And he said, show me, this is really, etc. So I pulled up my rig, set everything out, outside out patched the cell, threw alcohol at it, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. I tried again, nothing happened. I tried again, nothing happened. And to this day, I do not know why. I do not know why. And I'm making an analogy here with impact, because even though I was measuring what goes into this cell and what comes out of this cell, I did not know what was going on in that cell to give me the result it did. And to this day, I will never know. And it's the same sort of thing with impact, because we have these huge models about what impact is and how impact can be generated. And there's one very famous model here called the payback model. We know what goes in and we expect a certain response out. So if it's good impact and we produce impact, and this is how you produce impact, create the recipe for it, then you will get some good returns. That is not always the case, because what these models fail to take into account is what's going on in that cell. And until you know what's going on in that cell, impact is subject to the evaluation of the object rather than independent of it. And this is what happens in a lot of results that look at metrics, for example. They measure what goes into the evaluation process and they measure what comes out of the evaluation process. And based on that black box kind of analogy, they decide that metrics can replace peer review. But that's not true, because impact is not impact until someone says that it's impact. That's the most important issue. And those someones are a group of experts on a panel deciding how to evaluate this. So this changes the question a bit. So it changes the question from not what is impact, yes or no. Is this impact? Yes, so therefore you get points. Because we're not measuring impact in a binary decision. We're measuring impact about scales of excellence, which in the UK is 1 to 4 stars, 4 star being absolutely excellent. So it changes the question from what is impact to how do we value this impact? And that's a totally different way of looking at impact. The evaluation of impact is a process-orientated approach. It requires experts in a panel coming together with different ideas, which in the REF 2014 they did because this hadn't been done before. It was a beautiful natural experiment where people came in with different ideas about what impact was based on their experience as researchers, as well as the experience that they had had with impact themselves. And there were thousands of different viewpoints. And somehow in between, regardless of the preparation before, when you're looking at the proposals together with 30 people around the table, you've got to come to some level of consensus. And it's that process of coming to a consensus that decides about whether this impact is valuable or not, and how valuable this impact is. All right. So there are risks associated with a consensus-led approach to impact assessment that don't exist for a consensus-led approach for traditional measures of scientific excellence. Because scientific excellence, the norms are shared beyond the panel and are just being replicated and reconstructed within the panel itself. But for impact, that's different, because the idea of impact in 2014 was not yet, and it's more so now, but it's not, at that time it was not yet a very strong socialised norm that we teach PhD students about what is excellent impact. It's still quite ambiguous. And that just meant the evaluators brought very little decisions on how to assess it to the round table, very little prior experience. And what happened is that you get uncomfortable proxies within that evaluation process. That means that in the face of a time period, that overly pragmatic approaches are taken to the evaluation. And this can sometimes risk mirroring groupthink. Okay, does anyone know what groupthink is? Groupthink is when it is decided by the group that reaching a consensus is more important than making the right decision. And the funny thing about the peer review is that there is no right or wrong decision. The fact that the decision is made by a peer review panel of experts means that it's the right decision. So I'm not questioning the decisions here. What I was interested in is what was going on in that cell, how they were reached a consensus themselves. Now, I have to also make a point about this, because the idea about impact, and especially the very broad definition, both in the UK as well as globally, emphasises changes and benefits and positive effects. And when a consensus-led approach dominates the assessment of impact, there's always a risk of what we call grimpact. And grimpact is when Group impact is the impact that happens that doesn't necessarily have that benefit. Okay, and group impact is an idea that the construction of impact within peer review as well as within the science system is so framed towards positiveness, optimism. We want this because, again, these are used as political tools. So we want to say that research has positive benefits, but we're blind to the fact that research also can have negative benefits. I had to mention that as well. All right, so we've got 10 more minutes, so let's go through this quickly. So specifically for this audience, I wanted to talk about evaluation mechanics. And those are the things that, obviously, for the REF 2014, this panel had not done this before. It hadn't been done before. As Stephen said, it was a large experiment. Very successful experiment, and on some levels, but on other levels, it makes this question about how we might facilitate a discussion later. And one of the things that I talk about is what I call evaluation mechanics, and this has also been used as a term by other authors as well. And they're the structures and guidelines that are used to help guide the evaluation. But for me, a true peer review, especially when an item is ambiguous, should be driven by expert discussion, reaching a consensus, rather than overly using mechanics that can infiltrate the evaluation process and start mirroring groupthink. That is the unideal situation. And in my book, I look at typologies of this, type 1, type 2, the difference between whether the mechanics used were infiltrative or facilitative, and whether or not they had intended outcomes and unintended outcomes. Now, intended outcomes does not necessarily mean bad intentions. It just means that they were to play a specific role, and they would play that specific role. But to be more precise and particularly a little bit more academic about this, research mechanics can actually operate within these typologies, but to different extents. So it's more like a scale, etc. So type 2 is the ideal type. This is the type of mechanic you want to provide for a peer review process. This is the mechanic that will facilitate the evaluation but not infiltrate the decision. And and why infiltration is so important, why it's so dangerous, is because what happens when mechanics are infiltrative is that we see the artifacts in their outcomes. The outcomes end up mirroring the mechanics rather than the peer review panel building on the mechanics to develop their own meaning and construct their own idea about what is excellence around impact. And this has also been seen in other ambiguous concepts like interdisciplinary research, grand challenges, transdisciplinary research, etc. So obviously you want to avoid type 1, where you have intended outcomes and your intended outcome is to infiltrate the process, as well as type 3 where you have absolutely no intention of these mechanics don't actually serve a purpose, but they still do infiltrate the process. That one I haven't actually seen. And an evaluation, going back to my original argument about metrics versus peer review in the evaluation of impact, is exactly, and linking that to the idea of mechanics infiltrating an evaluation, is exactly this idea about bibliometrics informed peer review. The idea about peer review is not to replace it. The whole idea is that we can make it stronger. And metrics is not a replacement. What it is a mechanic. Because you can look at anybody in a peer review process, whether it's for traditional impact or societal impact, and they will use metrics in some way or another to guide their decision-making process. It's also because, in a way, citations are indications of what we already see ourselves as being extremely prone to valuing when it comes to identifying what is excellence in research. Whether or not it's a good thing or another thing, we identify and associate excellence with publishing in high-impact journals, gaining citations, and publishing with the right people, etc. And so mechanics can be used, metrics are used as a mechanic, and they can infiltrate the process. And what you see is exactly that. So all of these studies, which are very famous studies that correlate and start correlating metric expectations about excellence with the outcomes of peer review, and using that, what they end up doing is making the justification that therefore peer review can be replaced by metrics, is a circular argument. Because what happens is that peer review process is not independent from the influence of metrics to begin with. Metrics are being used within that peer review decision in the bibliometrics informed peer review way of the Metrics Tide and James Wilson crew, which Stephen was part of. They're being used to make decisions, to justify the decisions. So to make the argument that therefore, because the outcomes reflect what the metrics are is a false conclusion, because the metrics are already being used, and of course, therefore, when you correlate the peer review outcomes with metrics, of course, there's going to be a positive correlation. So you get a bit of a tautology here, where these metrics are infiltrating the evaluation, and what we're seeing and what these studies are finding is the infiltrative way in which metrics are being used in the evaluation process, not necessarily support the argument that therefore metrics can replace peer review. So I've got 5 more minutes, and I'll go straight through. So for the ref, for example, there are a variety of different mechanics that were provided to the panel and also provided to people who were making submissions too. And they were done they were available at different stages of the evaluation process. At the submission stage, which is the impact definition, the STAR outcome, which we as people who are submitting submissions, who are putting submissions into the ref panel, actually use to formulate our submissions. You know, it's like applying for a job. This is the selection criteria. You would be absolutely foolish not to write to the selection criteria. And then in the evaluation, these same sort of things are, and some other mechanics too, are given to the panels to be able to facilitate or infiltrate the evaluation process. And then again, we can use certain mechanics to interpret the results. And what my research has looked at is one of the things is we tried to work out we looked at how these panelists use these mechanics to make their decisions, rightly or wrongly. And I don't make a decision about whether this produced the right outcomes or not. But it wasn't necessarily an idealized idea about how to use metrics, because how to use the mechanics. Because the expertise wasn't there and because the experience wasn't there, these mechanics played an active role in the evaluation of themselves. So this is one of the interviews from one of the panelists out of the evaluation that said, despite the fact we were all saying, how are we ever going to get this right? How are we going to judge what is a 1, 2, 3, or 4 star in these rather vague written cases? When it came to it, it wasn't nearly as hard. And why wasn't it hard? It's partly due to the fact we got very clear advice from HEFC as how to interpret what we saw and how to grade we saw. So the question is, do these infiltrative mechanics allow the panel to produce a different idea or an independent idea about what is excellence for impact? Or do they infiltrate the process in a way that encourages a consensus-led approach that mirrors groupthink? This is what I argue in my book. So what is the future of evaluating impact? What I want to do is I want to change the language a bit. I don't want to talk about impact assessment anymore. I want to look at impact assessment not as a thing, but as a verb. It's something we do. So it's about evaluating impact as a process rather than only as an outcome. And again, I still believe in peer review for very good reasons, not because it's part of my academic upbringing, but because I think that peer review is a very valuable political and epistemological tool to evaluate what is excellence for both traditional as well as ambiguous criteria. So therefore, the decision is not for me, not exactly how to replace peer review with metrics, but to make peer review stronger. And there's a couple of insights that I have in my book, as well as personal insights and more insights as I continue work in this area about exactly how to do that. And the funny thing is that when you talk about impact assessment, we've got to really acknowledge the role that these evaluation mechanics play in not only infiltrating, for the want of a better word, or facilitating the impact assessment in the ref, but also in socializing the next generation of researchers who are coming up to the ref 2021. And you see that as well. So if peer review plays a powerful role in socializing the new generation of new generation thinking about what is excellence, then so do the mechanics that are used in these evaluations. And there's a very careful, which I've gained a lot more appreciation of over the last couple of days from talking to Stephen, of how difficult it is balance providing mechanics to a panel that facilitate the evaluation while still ensuring that they don't infiltrate and have wide-ranging community effects on the academic community. We're seeing that already in the UK. When you ask somebody, what is your article about and how good is it, they'll talk about it being a 4-star article. And they'll talk about themselves as being refable, which is, words such as reliable, capable, responsible, or all to do with how we assess being refable or not. And also, the new question, I guess, is the trust and the moral argument and the role that these evaluations play in socializing and in a way hiding the not so beneficial aspects of impact assessment, which we have termed GrimPact. Stay tuned. It's a very interesting process. So thank you so much for that. I hope you've enjoyed it. So yes, thank you very much.